Hey, Iostax here, former head coach of Excel2 Academy and Uprising Academy North American Contenders. Today I'm going to address another question from my Ask Stux Anything channel. If you want to ask your own questions, simply head down to the description, join the Discord and ping me in the channel. Today's question is by Hexadec and it is a very simple but also a very interesting question. He asks, what are your thoughts on age in esports? For example, if someone's already in their early 20s, do you think they have a reasonable shot of being picked up even if they can match the skill of younger players? And is it worth pursuing? So, when we were looking at age in esports, age only factors into 2 points, and that is marketability and that is mechanical ability. Now, the initial thought is that younger players are easier to market because they are more relatable to the overall younger audiences of esports. That said, however, there are still a lot of young people who idolize baseball, soccer or football players who might be in their 30s or 40s and have a lot of experience. And those sports are actually even more physically demanding than esports. So while marketability is something to take into account and the shelf life of a player is something that's being taken into consideration, it is only one of many factors and shouldn't deter anyone from trying to pursue a career like this. So the main challenge is actually learning mechanics at an older age. Learning mechanics at a younger age is fairly easy. It takes a little bit of time, but most players should be able to get to a decent level fairly quickly. However, as you progress in age, it is going to be more and more difficult to learn mechanics. That said, learning mechanics is very similar to, say, riding a bike, where if you learn it at a young age, it's not really something that you're going to unlearn. You'll always be able to do it. For example, I recently had a student that I worked with who was in his 40s and he used to play competitive first-person shooters a very, very long time ago. He played Quake and Tribes and a lot of old school games. And those games have taught him the fundamental mechanics, which allows him to be very, very strong mechanically right now, even though, as I mentioned, he's in his 40s. But if we would take a 40-year-old who has never played any FPS games before, he would have a much more difficult time actually learning those mechanics, and at that point it might be worth reconsidering another career. So, if older players can be marketable, and if it is possible for older players to have solid mechanics, why don't we see more adult players in esports? The reason is actually the same why we don't see a lot of female representation in esports, and that is culture-based. In the early 2000s, esports and competitive video games have been mostly dominated by young, kids, mostly male, that really like playing their games. Females and adults weren't really interested into it back then. And most adults today, especially in the early phases of first-person shooters when they first came out, were even less interested, right? So as time progressed, the problem is that the adults of today, as I mentioned earlier, mechanics is something that you have to learn at a young age. Most of them just didn't learn those mechanics at a young age because they weren't interested and video games weren't as widespread. And the reason there isn't as much female representation is because while today the gender ratio in terms of gamers is a lot more evenly split than it was back then playing as a female put you into a minority essentially, right? And that's again a problem because it means that the only players that could potentially consider getting into esports are so young and so fresh to the scene that they simply haven't had enough time to gain experience yet. However, this also means that as time progresses, I predict that we are going to see a lot more female players in esports, and we're also going to see a lot more adults in esports, especially players that are pros today who would like to keep their career going into their 30s, maybe even into their 40s, but only time will tell. So, if you're a female or someone of older age to go into esports, take these factors into account. If you're female and at a young age, you can go for it. It's going to take some time, but there's nothing that should be holding you back. And if you're an adult, you need to be a little bit more careful. If you have previous FPS experience and you feel comfortable with your mechanics, it's something you can do. However, if you're new to gaming and you're in your 30s or 40s, you're going to have a very, very difficult time actually getting those fundamentals down. That does it for today's video. Again, if you want to ask your own questions, make sure to join the Discord. You can also follow my Twitter and make sure to subscribe in order to see any of my new content. My name is Iostax and I'd like to thank you for learning.